show us this morning rocks with stories to tell. So that's going to be very exciting. So take it away, Ed.
Thanks for coming back.
Well, thanks for having me. I think, as I probably said last time, my rocks don't do any good sitting in the dark in their drawers at home. You got to get them, you got to trot them out and show them off. And these are some that don't make it out real often, so some of them might be a little bashful, but we'll try and get them through it. Rocks all have stories behind them. They all came from somewhere. They started out somehow and went through some kind of process to get the way they are, the way we see them here today. Sometimes the stories are pretty dull and really don't amount to much. Sometimes they have really intriguing backgrounds. Some of them have really intriguing backgrounds, but you'd never know because they look really dull, and so on and so forth. So where to begin? I don't know. I guess the story behind a name is one good place to start. One of the kind of an early breakthrough when Anne Sullivan was working with Helen Keller was, this is according to Helen's autobiography, it was when she realized that everything has a name. And when she associated the little finger gestures that Anne was making in her hand with an object, she said, aha, this means that. So that has a name, and everything else has a name too. So she went to work learning the names of everything. So names are important to give us a handle, by which to hold on to something and manipulate it, to communicate about it, and so forth. So this is a mineral fluorite. It's a pretty common mineral. There's lots of it around, and it's often very attractive. I brought a bunch of specimens of it, just partly. These are ones some of these I'll pass around because you could drive over them with your car and not hurt them. Others I don't handle much myself because they're delicate enough. I don't want to mess with them. These are kind of in between, but brought an assortment of fluorite specimens and showing the range of colors and appearances that they have. And I suppose later on maybe you can pass by and have a look at them. But fluorite is one mineral that comes in every color of the rainbow, sometimes several colors in one crystal. But the name is interesting, and it's a name that has gone both directions. The name both came from somewhere, and then that name moved on, got applied to other things later on. We have fluorescent lights in the ceiling here, and they owe their name to fluorite. But the name, the fluorescence, that name doesn't have anything to do with the origin of the name fluorite. Fluorite first came to people's attention back, I don't know, 1,000 years ago, more or less, when people were starting to smelt metals out of rocks. And they found that fluorite has a relatively low melting point, and it can be used as a flux to help the ores melt. And once you get it melded, then you can play with the chemistry of it and pull the metal apart from whatever it's bonded to and turn it into something more useful. So this mineral, as recently as 400 or 500 years ago, it didn't really have a name. It was just that stuff that melts easily. And it came to be known fluorite from the Latin fluos, which has to do with flowing. You get it hot enough, it melts and flows. So fluorite is that rock that melts. It turned out that when you expose some fluorite to ultraviolet light, nobody expected this, but they discovered that it glows. Ultraviolet light is invisible, or pretty nearly so, to human eyes. But when the ultraviolet light strikes some minerals like fluorite, the mineral glows in visible light. And nobody had ever seen that property before. And this was the mineral, the first mineral in which that was recognized. So this phenomenon, whatever the heck it is, we got to call it something. We'll call it fluorescence because it's what fluorite does. And that property of materials to glow when they're struck by ultraviolet light turned out to be really useful. And so we have fluorescent lights, we have fluorescent colors on materials because they glow. And so this is a mineral whose name kind of went both ways. It's a familiar mineral and it's named because it melts. And the fluorescence, that property, got named for this mineral. It doesn't have anything to do with melting, it has to do with glowing. And so that's what gives us fluorescent lights. So one of the other fun things about minerals is that the whole earth is made of minerals, the whole world. And so this little lineup of fluorite specimens comes from England, California, Illinois, England, New Mexico, Iowa, Czechoslovakia, and Mexico. So all those little chips of rock from around the world find themselves lined up on a table here in Gorham, Maine, for some reason.
I have some fluorite from Iowa where I went to college.
Ah, okay.
In my collection.
Probably a close relative of this one.
Is it brownie?
Brown,
Yep,
yep.
that's what I
This
got.
is from Pint's Quarry at Raymond.
I can't remember what it's called now, it's been so long. It's two crystals just intersected, they've melted together.
Emitter ground, yeah.
Formed, yeah.
And this would also, not all fluorite is fluorescent, but this is highly fluorescent, the stuff from Iowa is. And this one from the Czech Republic is totally inert under ultraviolet, but who knows why. Anyway, so that's a mineral that has a story of sorts to tell. Some rocks, the stories that some rocks tell give you an idea of the company that they've been keeping in the past. So this is a chip of quartz, a plain ordinary garden variety quartz. It's from a mine in Georgetown, Maine, which is up by Woolwich and Bath and up in that neighborhood along the coast. But it has this gray spot on it. And this is one that I'm happy to pass around. The gray spot there tells us that at some point in its past it had some radioactive material next to it, and the radiation disrupts the crystal structure of the quartz. When the quartz is intact, the crystals are the molecules are lined up neatly enough that light can pass through it. But if you have the right kind of radiation present in enough quantities, it disrupts the crystal structure enough that the light can't make its way through as readily, and you get dark spots in it. And that is no longer radioactive. It doesn't register with a Geiger counter at all. But just like charcoal that's been burned, it has been very hot at one time, but once the heat's dissipated, you can hold it in your hand and it doesn't hurt anything. That's the same sort of thing. It's been stained by the radiation, but the radiation itself is gone. Now this one, of course, this is from the same mine, and that's had a lot more little particles of radioactive material next to it. And we refer to it just as radiation burned quartz. And I find it kind of intriguing. If there's enough radiation present, we all know what quartz looks like, right? There's that piece. But at that particular mine, there are some areas where there's been a lot of radiation around and the quartz is just jet black. And I find that kind of cool too. So smoky quartz is popular for jewelry, and some crystals of it are attractive. This isn't particularly attractive, but it's still kind of cool. And I enjoy finding that when when I get to go to that mine. Let's see. So that is that. Oh, right. Sometimes, once in a while, you can actually find the culprit too. This stuff from the Georgetown mine has been exposed to radiation from somewhere. Well, right here is one of the sources. In the center of this light spot here is a little clump of uraninite crystals. That's uranium oxide. And this is hot as a firecracker. Bring a Geiger counter close to it. It goes on kind of tick, 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 tick. So this doesn't present any particular health hazards. Just holding it in your hand. I would not carry it around in my front pants pocket if I had family plans in the future or anything like that. Wouldn't keep it under my pillow. But sitting here on the table, it's not presenting a particular hazard any more than your luminous watch dial does. Probably less, in fact. So, and there's also a little tiny zircon crystal in there with that too. Which the Georgetown mine is a really interesting place. We're found a mineral there. This is all strictly of academic interest and has no practical use whatever, but we just identified a mineral recently that had not been found at that mine before, and in company with it were little crystals of something that had not been found in Maine before. So.
Where in Georgetown is that?
Well, Georgetown's not that big a place, so I don't know.
No.
It's the only place I've been in Georgetown is there, so I don't know what it is in relation to anything else. It's out on the peninsula a little ways. It's on the Collins property. If you know Charlie Collins,
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's right stone's throw from his house.
Oh.
Big hole in the ground out there. It was originally a feldspar mine. That was what they mined there commercially, starting back middle of the 19th century. Mined feldspar for ceramics, and it turns out there's all kinds of other stuff there too. It's not really of much commercial interest, but of considerable academic interest, among collectors. So there's also some good gem quality aquamarine has been found there. It's not spectacular, but it's nice. So anyway, that's a story well, another thing you'll notice about this one is it comes around, there's the little spot where the uraninite is, and then there's a kind of a radiating pattern of cracks out around it. That's just disruption of the quartz crystal by the radiation emanating from that little crystal of uraninite there. So it's interesting stuff.
Obsidian, doesn't it?
It does. It's black and glassy, but obsidian is a form of glass, and although they look a lot alike from out here, down at the molecular level, the crystal is really strictly ordered. The molecules are all lined up in rows and columns and sheets, and it's highly organized. Glass, like obsidian, is the absolute opposite. It's totally chaotic, no order, no organization to it at all. And it's kind of ironic that really high quality glass that's used for artistic purposes is known as crystal, even though it's at the molecular level, it's the absolute opposite of true crystal. It's just one of those terms that goes back to before people understood about molecular structures of things. It looks like crystal, so we'll call it crystal. So anyway, so these are all kind of accumulating over that way. That's fine. I'll just pick them up down there when the time comes.
At the end, I'll bring them to you.
Okay. So where do we go from here? The mine at Georgetown is in a type of rock called granite pegmatite. Granite, living in Maine, we know about granite. It's a fairly fine-grained igneous rock. If you look at it closely, you'll see little crystal grains of feldspar and little masses of quartz and probably flakes of mica. Those are the three minerals you got to have in order to call a rock granite. In a pegmatite, the crystals, instead of having a bazillion little tiny crystals, the minerals are able to sort themselves out while they're crystallizing a lot better. And so instead of a bazillion little crystals, you get a few much bigger crystals. And in pegmatite, instead of having little grains of feldspar like that, you can have feldspar crystals the size of a suitcase, or bigger, or a refrigerator even. And that's why they like to mine in pegmatites for feldspar for ceramics, because you can't crush up granite and sort out the feldspar very easily. That would be a real chore. But if you can find a big half-ton mass of solid feldspar, just one big crystal of it, and pry that out, that you can sell to a ceramics company. They can grind it up and make toilets or dishes or dentures or whatever they're making out of their ceramic material. One thing that goes on in pegmatites sometimes, you'll have quartz and feldspar trying to crystallize at the same time. And as the feldspar crystals are forming, it kind of pushes the quartz aside along the edges of what would be the feldspar crystals. And so you have little ribbons of quartz running through the rock, making these figures like this. And in some cases, it looks like writing or hieroglyphics or something. And as we know, the Latin graphos, or that might even be Greek, I don't know. It is a Greek, okay, has to do with writing. So they call this graphic granite. This is from pegmatite in the Black Hills in South Dakota, where I worked there for the National Park Service for several summers and did a lot of collecting in mines out there. Graphic granite is really fascinating material, and I have a hard time passing up a good piece of it when I see it somewhere. And so this one I didn't pass up, I brought home. But
What did you call it again?
graphic granite.
Graphic.
Yeah. It's still granite, it's feldspar and quartz and mica, but it has this particular texture to it, so it gets that additional name. The story that goes with graphic granite is that one place, it occurs all around the world, wherever you have pegmatite type granite forming. One place where you find graphic granite is Mount Sinai. And it has been suggested that Moses' tablets with the writing in the stone might have been slabs of graphic granite. Now, on the one hand, that could be, people could consider that kind of assertion as sacrilegious and seeking to contradict Scripture. But I see no reason why God shouldn't have caused those particular slabs of graphic granite to appear with the right text on them. So who knows? But that's one story that has been floated over the years. Now that I don't know whether you'll find anything significant written in granite from the Tip Top mine in Custer County, South Dakota, but it's still a neat rock. Yeah, Lakota. This is another piece of graphic type granite from that same Georgetown mine in Georgetown, and it's a little bigger, and I see it has some pieces, little bits, flakes of mica shedding off it, but that can make the rounds too if you want. And you notice the quartz in this one is mostly white or just a little bit grayish. This one, the quartz is black because it's from the same side of the mine at Georgetown that had, the black quartz in it. So that's really striking to have the white feldspar and the black quartz, intergrown like that. pretty cool.
Pretty much alpha radiation
You'll get,
from,
I think so. I think the alpha radiation is what does the damage to darken the quartz, because big particles flying around that'll would bust up the molecular bonds. You're a chemist? Okay, so you probably, would alpha be the most likely?
well, where
Or-
you're saying that here in Maine, it's mostly uranium
Mhm.
or thorium. And
Yeah.
those are both alpha.
That other mineral that I said was being first, if it turns out to be what we think it is, would be the first record of it in Maine is called charoite, which among other things has thorium in it. It's a rare earth like cerium and lanthanum and whatnot, and thorium phosphate
Interesting.
with a little silicon substituting in for some of the phosphorus. So it's a phosphate silicate, which is not real common in the mineral world. You usually have one or the other, but this may be both. Anyway, kind of neat stuff. Little teeny tiny 1/2 millimeter green grains, but anyway. Now what? Well, we all know that rocks are really, really old, right? Something can be as old as rocks, in fact. Well, now this is a little volcanic rock, highly uninteresting in its own merits, but it's from the Parish volcano in Mexico, which didn't exist prior to 1943. It was a relatively level field. But in 1943, there were some earthquakes, and a fissure opened up in the ground, and gases and things started coming up out of it. And in a few months, a big cinder cone was built up there. And this is a stone. This is a little volcanic bomb from that site. So we know that this rock, probably didn't come into existence as it is now, as we see it now, until the 1940s. And the eruption had ended in 1952. So you can kind of bracket it between 1943 and 1952. So that's not that old a rock, really.
That's a baby,
Yeah.
baby rock.
There's a volcano in Costa Rica that I had opportunity to visit a few times around 1990, give or take a couple of years, called Arenal. And that's another one that, it's not a brand new volcano, but it was thought to be extinct until 1968, when it proved otherwise. In fact, there's a story that just in grade school in the little town of La Fortuna, which is the town right nearby, the students were writing about local landmarks and features and so on, and somebody mentioned, one of the kids described Arenal as a volcano. And this was before it had erupted, and the teacher corrected it, says, no, it's not a volcano, it's just a mountain. And a few years later, it exploded and killed 68 people and and so on. But at any rate, this is a volcanic bomb from Arenal. A bomb is material that was molten as lava in an ejected explosively, and it solidified in the air and landed. And this is a particular style of bomb called a bread crust bomb. And as you see it when it comes by, it has a crust on the outside that's kind of cracked a little bit, like bread crusts do sometimes as they rise in baking. The thing that makes that happen, the story behind that appearance, is that volcanic lava has a lot of gas in it. It's the gases that drive these big, powerful eruptions. Down underground, the gases are kept in solution in the lava, but as they move up toward the surface, there's less pressure on top of them, and the gases start to expand, and they kind of fizz out of the lava. Just like the example's always, popping the top off a carbonated drink. Once the pressure's released, then the gas can fizz out and it can bubble out and make a mess. Well, in the case of this kind of lava, it makes more than a little mess. There's a huge amount of pressure. This kind of lava has a fairly high melting point, so it takes a lot of heat to keep it fluid. It cools a little bit, it stiffens right up and blocks the conduit. But meanwhile, the gas down below is still trying to come out of solution, and it's pushing. So it slows down a little bit, it solidifies, it plugs it up, the gas keeps building up pressure. Finally, it overcomes the strength of the plug. Kaboom! You get a giant explosive eruption like Mount St. Helens did. And all that gas finally can get loose.
Isn't that what they're expecting from the volcano in Hawaii now?
Yeah, something along those lines. Kind of, sort of. It's a different style of volcano, and there's still a lot of gas in the magma, but what they're expecting there is a steam explosion where groundwater comes in contact with the magma and turns to steam and blows things to pieces. So the result is similar, but the mechanism's a little different. Yeah. So all that gas that's in the lava or in the magma, as it flies through the air, the outside, the gas fizzes out and the surface solidifies, but the inside is still soft and trying to expand. So it cracks up that shell that formed on the outside. This is a smaller one. You can see it's broken, and you can see that harder shell on the outside where the gas fizzed out of it. It solidified, made a shell, and as it flew through the air, the gas on the inside was still saying, "Let me out!" And it pushed, and it probably burst apart in the air and landed in pieces like we see it here. I found a beautiful volcanic bomb down there on the outside the volcano. It was about the size of a basketball, and it was broken in two. No, that one was intact. It was intact all the way around. It had this kind of cracked crust on it. It was too big to be practical to carry back. I mean, this was a scientific expedition under auspices of the Smithsonian and all that, but I still wasn't carrying it back to camp. So it's still there somewhere. So this dates, these volcanic bombs here are even newer than that little cinder from Parish, because these have to be sometime after 1968. They're probably in the 1970s or 80s. And then newer yet, the last trip I made there was in 1994. And this is a little piece of lava that a small party of intrepid people, led by the expedition leader, of course, because he's not going to send somebody else out to do something like this. It's a highly active volcano. It's blowing stuff out all the time. But they made a trip up onto the actual cone and to an active lava flow and brought back some samples. And this is from a lava flow that started in January of 1994. So, and it was collected in April of 94. So I had a niece who was born a week before I went. I stopped and saw her at the hospital, on my way out of town to go to Costa Rica. And so this little piece of lava is just as old as she is. So as old as rocks, maybe not. Well, let's see. Some of the stories that the rocks tell has to do with their human history. The geological history, may or may not be very interesting, but this is something a specimen I bought from a dealer that is a staggeringly unremarkable little lump of lead ore. But the interesting part of it is the label that is pasted on the one side. says Argentiferous galena from Black Hills, Dakota Territory. The L.W. Stillwell, Deadwood, Dakota Territory. So that's, I did some research and found out that L.W. Stillwell set up a business in Lead, South Dakota, or in Deadwood, and sold, among other things, geological specimens. And the fact that it says Dakota Territory kind of brackets the age. Deadwood and Lead were established in 1879, and the Dakotas received statehood in 1889. So this specimen probably dates to, sometime in the 1880s when he was in business there. And it sat probably more or less undisturbed in a drawer at the University of Chicago for the next 100 years. And they finally had a closet cleaning of some sort, and that dealer acquired some material of theirs. And so this little specimen, as a specimen, doesn't really amount to much, but the label is pretty cool. And so you're welcome to have a look at that. Please don't peel the label off it. Here's another one, a similar vintage from my own home territory. The Academy of Natural Science in Philadelphia is one of the grand old scientific institutions in the United States. It dates back to, as an institution, back to the second quarter of the 1800s. And they had a huge and historically significant mineral collection that, for whatever reason, the institution decided they weren't all that interested in, and they never really did have a big mineral display. So since at least the 1960s, almost the entire collection had been in storage, and they didn't make any use of it. The trustees finally decided, let's just get rid of it. So, to great hue and cry from historians and so on, they struck deals with some museums and some specimen dealers to liquidate this fabulous historic old collection. A few pieces of which landed in my collection by way of some dealers. So this is a little geode from southeastern Iowa, which is not far from my home territory. And so I figured it would be fun to have an old, an antique specimen from Iowa that still has its, Academy of Natural Sciences label. It's got a very low catalog number for their collection, 2,440. And so it, just that kind of dates it way back. When I received it, I lifted this label out of the box that it had reposed in a drawer in Philadelphia for who knows how long. And underneath that was this little note from the supplier. It says, we have not less than 3 tons in our collection. They are of all conceivable shapes and sizes, from as large as a hazelnut to the size of 3 feet in diameter, etc., etc. The note is on just an old envelope front from an insurance company in Keokuk. And I'm told this style of postmark, it doesn't have a year on it, but it was current in the 1870s. Wow. So, again, I would not buy this specimen as it is from a dealer, except for the cultural history that it has with it. And it does have 3 old catalog numbers on the back, in addition to my own. So it now has 4 catalog numbers on it. And only the latest one probably matches the number on the tag there. So there's 2 other styles of catalog numbers on it. So it's not much of a rock, but it still has a kind of a story to tell. And that one I'll keep here. You can have a check or you can check it out later on if you want.
And what did you say this was?
It is,
Oh, galena, I'm sorry.
yeah, it's argentiferous galena. Argentiferous means that it contains silver, and argentum being silver in Latin, or argent in French. Yeah, which comes from the Latin argentum, etc. Galena is just lead sulfide, but it frequently has at least a little silver in it. And there are plenty of places in the world where the galena is mined for its silver content and the lead is a byproduct. And that's the case probably with this. This is an ore sample. And I don't know how rich it is in silver, but if you see on the one side, there's little cleavages in it where it broke. And I'm told by one old timer that whenever galena, you see the cleavage planes in galena curving, that it's worth testing it for silver. It just that the silver disrupts the crystal structure enough that it changes the appearance. So that might have been what led whoever found that in the first place to assay it and see what's in it. Where to from there? Well, I guess talking about human history, we have here another little specimen. It's in two pieces, and I purchased it as a pair of pieces, but in messing around with it, I found that they fit together. I don't remember exactly how, but into one piece. I haven't decided yet whether to glue it together or not, but it comes with a history, as you might guess. And it's actually interesting to me for two historical reasons. First of all, it came with a label from the William Jeffress collection. He was a collector in Philadelphia. He was a banker, and he died in 1906. He collected from childhood up until his death, and he was had one of the largest and best known private collections of minerals around. And so it's cool to be. I get to take care of a specimen that he took care of for all that time. After his death, Andrew Carnegie purchased his collection and donated it to the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. Took 2 railroad cars to ship it from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. And so we have the Carnegie Museum label that goes with it as well. And something else that then is interesting about this specimen is where it came from. It says it's a silver islet in Lake Superior. The silver islet was an extraordinary little silver mine that was discovered off the shore of Ontario, off the north shore of Ontario. There's a lot of silver up in that territory, and a company that owned some land back in the 1860s decided to survey their territory thoroughly, make a proper geographic survey of it. And they wanted to start with getting a map of the coastline, and then they kind of work in from there. So they sent a surveyor out to do this job, and he figured a good way to survey the coast is to get out to some of these islands offshore, and then you can get good fixes on the points along the coast. You can draw the coastal map and work in from there. On one of these little rocks, it was barely above the water, the surveyor noticed that there's a big vein running across it of something that looked interesting. You could see it continued off underwater. So brought some pieces back, and it turned out to be argentiferous galena, and pretty worthwhile argentiferous galena. So they did some more testing and found that it assayed high enough to be worth further work. They ended up developing a mine on this little. It was only about 75 feet in diameter, and with a good wind, the waves would wash over it completely on a good day. So they decided, to build a little coffer dam around it and start sinking a shaft, and they got into paying ore pretty soon. But if you know anything about Lake Superior, the winter storms are legendary. So their first season, they started in the spring. In October of that year, they had a little structure build up. They were starting to produce some ore. And a storm, the first storm of the season, blew up. And they decided, okay, we're heading for shore. They evacuated the island. They sat out the storm for 3 days, wondered how much would be left when they got out there, and found that, in fact, pretty much nothing was left of what they'd built. Debris washed up, 300 miles away in Duluth. And so they rebuilt it, built it a little bigger and stronger. And the next winter storms blew that away. They started hauling out rock from the mainland and enlarged the island. They built, they took 6,000 yards of timbers out. They pinned it in place with 2-inch steel rods. And the next winter that got blown away. They enlarged it more. They built a bigger, stronger wall around it, timber wall around it, and that got blown away. So finally I said, okay, let's get serious here. They built a whole new island. They opened up a quarry on the mainland. They shipped out rock and expanded way out around it. This time they cribbed it up with timber, but instead of pinning it solidly in place with steel rods, they just cabled it in place. They thought maybe leaving a little flexibility would hold it. And so after the next winter storms, that one actually held. And so they mined down to a depth of 2,100 feet. From 1869 to 1883, it was one of the hottest mining properties in the world. And the ore, initially it was, kind of reasonably worth the effort at about $4,000 worth of silver per ton of ore. They got into some high-grade stuff that was producing $17,000 of silver per ton. 1 ton of rock would fill a crib. If you just hollowed that out, that would be about a ton of rock. And so they would get $17,000 worth of silver out of every one of those at 1870 prices. And then finally the ore petered out, and they had to pump a lot of water out of it continuously. That was the key to keeping the mine in operation. Finally, in 1883, the ore was petering out, and then the ship that was supposed to be bringing the winter's supply of coal to keep the pumps running over the winter got frozen in ice in a channel and couldn't make the delivery. The coal ran out in March, the pump stopped, the mine flooded, and the directors said, okay, enough's enough. And the island has since reverted back to its natural state. There's not a single structure left on it. They've all been blown away by the Lake Superior storms after the last 100 years. You can still see the shaft. You can paddle a boat over it, and there it is going down in. And okay,
I just wanna look at it.
so she's got pictures
And
of Silver
I
Islet.
found it
Yeah,
on the internet. It's
Yeah.
pretty cool. I'll save it.
yeah. And so these little unremarkable calcite crystals that once sat in William Jeffress's cabinet in his house in Philadelphia originated somewhere down underneath Silver Islet in Lake Superior. So that's one of my favorite specimens now, right? I enjoy the story, and I enjoy the connection with Mr. Jeffress, and just these specimens with the old human history stories with them are interesting as well. I think just one last pair of examples here, and then I'll wrap up. It's kind of on its way to being slate. It's not quite there yet. It's still shale, I think. At least that's what I'm told. But the interesting thing about it is that it's got mud cracks on it. So that's from Basin County, Montana, and not too far from Missoula. And So that's a case where there was a mud flat, and it dried out and it cracked, and then more mud covered that over and filled in the cracks. And I have the other piece of it too. So I picked it up, and when I split it, well, actually that was the outside surface, but the inside surface also has some cracks on it. There was another layer of mud cracks. So those are just really, really old mud cracks. So that also tells a story that layer of rock goes far enough back in geologic time to before the Earth had a reliably oxygen-containing atmosphere. This layer of rock kind of alternates between this kind of purplish, reddish color and a kind of a mint green, kind of the color of the bulletin board back there. And that has to do with whether there was enough oxygen in the atmosphere to oxidize the iron, or whether it was remaining as a silicate, which is green. And so the oxygen was kind of oscillating back, or the atmosphere was kind of oscillating back and forth between oxygen rich and oxygen poor at the time these layers of rock were being laid down. So that's an interesting interesting little footnote to that one. So that's a kind of a two-dimensional mud crack. We're used to seeing mud cracks just on a flat surface. We have here a three-dimensional mud crack. This is a really odd little thing. It's from Mexico. You know why mud cracks? It shrinks as it dries out, right? Clay mud holds a lot of water, and get the sun beating down on it, the water evaporates, and the clay shrinks, and something's got to give, so it cracks and splits up. Well, imagine a ball of mud that has gotten buried in other, different kind of sediment, and it dries out. The surface of the ball of mud is stuck to whatever it's buried in, so it can't really go anywhere as it shrinks. So as it's shrinking, something gives in the center, and a little opening appears, and it splits sort of from the inside out, and you get these mud cracks inside. Then later on, time passes, turn the hourglass over, and the cracks that are left inside get filled up with some other material. So you end up with a solid ball with the cracks filled up inside. Then that somehow finds its way to the surface, and it gets rained on, and who knows what else happens to it, and the mud gets washed away, but the cracks are left standing there. So that is a set of petrified mud cracks in three dimensions, no less. And finally, I said at the beginning that every rock has a story. They all came from somewhere and went through some sequence of processes to take the appearance that we see them in here today in our hand. Often I'm not a professional geologist. I don't have any academic training in geology. I've just picked it up on the streets here and there. So a real geologist or petrologist probably could figure this out. But often I can look at a rock and make a good guess as to more or less how it came to be in the form it's in. This one, on the other hand, I don't have any idea what its story is. So there is a story in there somewhere, but it's going to be somebody smarter than me is going to have to pry it out of it. So for now, that one just gets to sit there and keep its story to itself.
Where did you get it?
That came from Gotts Island off of Southwest Harbor, off of Mount Desert Island, here in Maine. Now where it came from there, who knows, because glaciers probably dragged it down from somewhere up in Quebec, and who knows. So that's pretty much, I have a few others I didn't, okay, sorry, I got This one here, grand finale. We also know about things being hard as a rock, right? Well, this is a piece of sandstone. It's just a long thin slice of it, and its claim to fame is that it's flexible. It's from North Carolina, and its immediate story is that my uncle taught at Eastern Carolina University in Greenville. We're visiting him in town, and the geology department happened to be having their annual closet cleaning sale, and they had a few pieces of this flexible sandstone, and so I bought every one they had. And it's a real treasure. This also is one I'd rather not pass around because it is kind of fragile, but it does, yeah. But that's always a real crowd pleaser. What happened is it's sandstone, so it's just sand that piled up, got packed together. Usually sandstone just gets glued together with clay or calcite or iron oxide, something pretty boring, and it ends up as a solid rock. If you heat and press sandstone, then the grains of sand melt a little bit and they start to fuse together. You get a rock called quartzite, which is really hard. It's just tough as nails. It's dreadful stuff to deal with. However, this particular batch of sand had a lot of mica in it. So in among the layers of sand, there's also these little microscopic flakes of mica packed in there. Mica is really heat resistant, so it takes a lot of heat and pressure to affect it. So this has been lightly metamorphosed. It's been put under some heat and pressure. So the sand grains, I get my hands free so I can talk again. The sand grains have been kind of mushed among each other, so they're kind of linked together. And that would be quartzite if it weren't for the mica in between the sand grains, keeping them from sticking together. So they're kind of locked and linked together like that, but they're still lubricated with mica in between. And that's why, instead of setting up like a respectable normal rock, it's able to do that. So that's another treasure in the collection. And I think I'll leave it at that. You're welcome to come up and have a look at whatever I brought. If you got any questions or anything, yeah.
You mentioned a mine in Georgetown.
Mhm.
Is that something the public can visit, or is it?
No.
No.
In fact, if you go in, you got to go by Charlie Collins' house to get there, and he's watching, and he will come and talk to you, and heave you out.
Says it's a commercial.
It's private property.
Private commercial mine.
It's leased to someone, as they give access to the mine for field trips for organized clubs. So as a member of the Maine Mineralogical and Geological Society, if we have an organized field trip, we can go in there. The place is well enough known that when we had our first field trip in recent times there 5 years ago, we had hundreds of people coming out of the woodwork. As soon as word got out, we were going to Georgetown. And it was a big boost for membership in the club. And there were
How big would the mine be?
It's a big hole. Again, you can. There's a website called mindat.org, and if you look up the Georgetown, search for Georgetown, and you'll among all the other Georgetowns, there's a consolidated quarry in Georgetown, Maine, and there's some photographs of it. You can also look at it on Google Earth too. It's big enough you can spot it there. But it's the main pit is 300 or 400 feet one way and 200 or 300 feet the other way. There's a little extension off that way that's another probably 300 feet, and it's probably 200 feet deep. So it's a big,
We're an organized club.
and you gotta have liability insurance. So
We went through the church.
so anyway, so yeah. This one, that's another piece of that black quartz from Georgetown. Yeah, same stuff.
Almost looks like I'm sitting.
It does. Yep.
Where in Iowa are you from?
Was born in Cedar Falls, went to high school in DeWitt, lived 25 years or so in Iowa City, West Branch area.
You know, I got my Bachelor of Science in Geology at Cornell
Yeah,
College.
in Mount Vernon.
Yep, Mount
Mhm.
Vernon.
You know Paul Garvin?
Paul Gardner
geologist.
was my idol.
Yep.
Yep.
I knew him while I was there.
He
He's
was a wondrously and brilliant man, and he was also a devout Mormon.
is that right?
And we often questioned him as young people. How could you possibly teach this
Hmm.
if you believe in God and creation? And he was the first person that ever said to me that God created the world in 6 days. No one ever said it was a 24-hour day.
Right.
And he was brilliant. He tutored me personally to get through the calculus part of geology, which I struggled
Mhm.
horribly with.
Mhm.
I can't remember, there's some mines and quarries there in that area where we went, and I have rocks in my collection at home, guys, that have those little labels on them that were for my projects. And
Yep.
I have a piece of that brown fluorite.
Yep.
I have to admit, in my ignorance, I had no idea that there were mines even in Maine. Are there feldspar mines or
The
other
only
mineral mines in Maine other than that one?
the only commercial mining for industrial use that I'm aware of in mine now, other than quarries for road rock and things, are at the Dragon Cement plant in Rockland.
Oh, okay.
There's a marble deposit there that they mine for calcium carbonate to make concrete out of, make cement out of. The Maine's mining history is mostly around pegmatites for feldspar for ceramics, and mica for electrical insulators, and gemstones. The Mount Mica in Paris was the first producing gem tourmaline mine in the Western Hemisphere. The gem tourmaline was first found down Connecticut, but the first commercial production of it was at Mount Mica in the 1820s. There's also slate, has been mined various places. The Monson area is where some really super high quality slate was mined for things like billiard tables and laboratory furniture, and as well as monuments and shingles and that kind of thing. What else?
Where are the slate mines?
Monson, which is where's Monson? Around Brownville. I can kind of picture it on the map, but I can't tell you can't say what it's close to.
Last year when he came, Lorraine and Rosalie talked about how when they were younger, they used to go up to near Mount Mica, Paris, that area up there, and hunt tourmalines. There are places you can
There-
go, and the kids in the 5th grade go.
Yeah, I guess
They're there.
the only I made the distinction between industrial mining and others. The only producing gem tourmaline mine in the United States is the Havey Quarry at Poland, Maine. If you've seen Cross Jewelers ads for their Sparhawk teal tourmaline, that comes from the Havey Quarry in Poland. And the guy who runs that owns that as a member of our club. We've had field trips there. Of course, he keeps very close wraps on where we can go there, and if there's a big pile of rock and a big blasting net over it, that's where the good stuff is. That you guys can go over here. So that's what most of Maine's mining. There has been a little metal mining. There was some low key iron mining One place I know was around Shapley. There was a little bit of iron smelting was done there. That's for bog iron, where that's just in swamps. Sometimes iron oxide, you get kind of lumps and sheets of, and they would just go out in boats and take poles and stick in the mud and thump. There's a hard piece, so take hooks and haul that up on the boat and go poling around somewhere. Oh, there's another one. Okay, and pull that, drag that out. But they made it pay for a short time. And over around Blue Hill, there was copper. A little bit of copper was mined there. Brooksville, yeah. The Callahan mine.
A lot of cleanup issues.
Yeah.
there.
Oh, yeah. That's the flip side of metal mining, and that's a big difference between pegmatite mining and metal mining. The things you mine in pegmatites are useful because they're not very chemically reactive. Feldspar makes good ceramics, and why are ceramics useful? Because you can put them on fires, you can cook in them, you can do all kinds of stuff without affecting them. And so groundwater soaking through a pegmatite and soaking past all this feldspar and quartz and mica doesn't contaminate the water particularly. Metals are a whole different ballgame. Metal deposits include sulfur and arsenic and lead and cadmium and all kinds of really toxic materials. And water soaking through a metal deposit can pick up that stuff and carry it elsewhere. And that's an intact deposit. If you go in and blast it up into pieces and fill it full of holes, that increases the surface area, and the water soaking through that picks up a lot more of all that nastiness and carries it away. And so that's the problem. That's the difference between pegmatite mining, which Maine has done for going on 200 years, and the metal mining, which is a hotter issue in recent times. So on the one hand, if you want copper wires in your phone, the copper's got to come from somewhere, and dug out of the ground is kind of where it's got to come from. But on the other hand, it's got to be done in such a way that you don't make a bigger mess, or a mess that's bigger than the benefit you derive from the stuff. So it's a balancing act. And there was a copper mine developed in Wisconsin back in the 80s, where it was right next to a town. It was a deposit that was discovered by drilling, and it's an extraordinary deposit. They made a huge amount of money out of it, and they totally reclaimed the site and got the whole operation from beginning to end without any major environmental problems, complaints from the town. There's a nursing home X far away, an elementary school this far away, so on. And they went to great lengths to do it, safely, responsibly, without making a huge mess that would have to be cleaned up by somebody else. And it's still paid, and everybody made a profit, and it's all covered over in grass and everything now, and everybody's happy. But it was also an extraordinary deposit too. I mean, the ore they were taking out of there was 60% copper, and that was just load it up with an end loader and dump it in the truck, and that truckload is 60% copper. And ship it to a smelter somewhere, and you're done. And you can't get away with that in most metal mines. That was an extraordinary deposit, but they made it work in that case. So it can be done under the right circumstances. But
How is it that, I've been to rock places with grandkids and all, and we've done the geode thing. None of them come from Maine, they're all from New Mexico. What does it take for geode, and why don't we have any? Or do we?
well, we don't. And that's because most geodes form in sedimentary rock, limestone especially. There's not a whole lot of limestone in most of Maine. There are places where there is some, but for whatever reason, I'm not aware of it forming geodes. There's a lot of discussion about exactly how your sedimentary, they call them Midwest type geodes, because southeastern Iowa, northwestern Illinois is kind of the classic place to find them, and on in Indiana and Ohio. But somehow you've got to have some way of forming these little round voids in the rock and then getting them lined with crystals of things. And the exact sequence of events it takes to make that happen is not still 100% understood. Another option is the Mexican ones, the so-called coconut geodes. Those are from a volcanic environment. And they form in, I think, in ash fall deposits. And again, somehow you've got to have a, something to form the voids, and then to get the voids lined with crystals and so on. And they don't form just everywhere. So that's one thing you're not going to find in Maine.
Yeah.
Of course, in my home territory in Iowa, you don't find gem tourmaline just lying on the ground. So, different places have their own geologic specialties.
Thank you.
Anything else? Okay. Well,
Thank you so
thank you for having me.
This rock right in front of you is.
Whenever they, I think, oh, that sounds interesting, so I'm always looking stuff up on the computer.
Yes, it
on the
does.
phone, or the same, same thing.
Yes, it's amazing.
That's an
Well, it's
interesting.
how the Rosalie couldn't
Yeah.
come in the rain. I know they love this kind of stuff.
I like sometimes just handing it to somebody, no explanation, just here.
Some parts of the Carolinas produce sharpening stuff.